Hey everyone, back for another episode of the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast. I am Ben Wilson. She is Kaylee Bynes, joining me once again from Maryland. I'm here in Wisconsin as we are now rolling into the August month, as we're getting a couple more exciting podcast episodes in here as we're well into summer, and we continue today with actually someone from who's in practicing now in Kaylee, my home state, in Dr. Michael Putman. So take that for all the East Coast guests we've had. I probably shouldn't keep mentioning it, Kaylee, because I feel like now we're getting a pretty even distribution, and people are probably getting really annoyed that I bring it up almost every time. But you know what? A, it's an easy icebreaker. B, I have a weird infatuation with like geography and where our guests are from, so that's why. But
I feel like it's Midwest pride. It seems like something that I've heard from a lot of Midwesterners.
It is. I don't know why, but you know, when I lived in Missouri, everybody I knew from St. Louis, they all moved back to St. Louis. Most of my friends in Wisconsin will eventually probably move back to Wisconsin, and you know, it is you are exactly right on that, and yeah, we're proud of it. But nobody really cares about that. What they care about is our podcast guest, in Dr. Putman, who is going to come on. We'll talk a little bit about the ACR, American College of Rheumatology, guidelines that are just in the process of being released now, and he'll just give us kind of a rundown, just some general thoughts on the impacts that those are going to have, as well as his current practice, Kaylee. And it's kind of cool to see a younger doctor like Dr. Putman, some of the things he has done, how he's spent time in the Chicago area, but now starting a new program. He's going to be the medical director of the vasculitis program at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee at Froedtert, which is a brand new program. So pretty cool. I'm curious to hear just how that all works when you're building a new program up from the ground floor like he is.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting. He also has a background in education, in evidence-based medicine, meta research, and a lot of health communication, which for me personally, I'm really passionate about. So I'm excited to hear from him on those fronts as well.
Yeah, you're exactly right on that. Should be a great episode. Hope you enjoy it. Coming up, it's Dr. Mike Putman here on the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast. We'll be joined by Dr. Putman right after this. Let's welcome in now to the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast our next guest, Dr. Mike Putman. So glad to have you on, Dr. Putman. I understand, as we just introed you and some of the current things you're working on, quite the interesting time for all of us as you're getting ready to begin this big process of leading the vasculitis program at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. But I understand you're also like demolishing a house you just bought. I mean, you've got to be in a very unique subsector of medical professionals focusing on vasculitis who also have the ability to just tear down houses. I guess that's, as a fellow Wisconsinite, I will tell you that is a good way to ingratiate yourself with the community. So I hope that's going.
Yeah, no, I have to say that it's a lot easier to tear things apart than it is to rebuild them. So for background, I'm moving into a new house because I'm changing jobs and moving to Wisconsin. I'm starting a vasculitis program at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and as part of that, we bought kind of an old house. So I've been demolishing it and painting and trimming and doing all sorts of things. So it's been quite an adventure. But thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on the podcast. I've been listening to all the episodes, and you've had some illustrious guests. So it's certainly an honor to be on here. So thank you for having me.
Hey, yeah, absolutely. And for Kaylee, I've been kind of rubbing it in. Our last two guests now, Midwesterners, and for Kaylee, we had a run of all these East Coast guests that Kaylee could just relate to from proximity in Maryland. So I feel like I get to rub it in. Maybe we'll have to send you, like a cheese head or like a beer stein as a housewarming gift. Maybe that's a possibility.
No,
I don't know.
Represent Midwest.
I just know that you yeah. Yes, no, it's a good thing. So I'm sorry, Kaylee. Don't mean to rub it in. That's just how it is. We're very personal on this podcast. I'm sure too, though. I mean, you're developing this new program at the Medical College of Wisconsin there in Milwaukee. You'll be, as we mentioned, the assistant professor of medicine there. I think Kaylee and I are both kind of wondering. Well, most of the guests we've had so far are, I think, already well established in their respective current practices. At least they had been. I don't think we've had, correct me if I'm wrong, Keely, not many of our guests have been in that kind of new transition sort of mode, going into a new kind of field outside of Dr. Hussein, who's kind of in that extremely young, just beginning his career. So I'm curious what that process has been like. I mean, you're going into a community where, like, I was diagnosed in Milwaukee, so I know there was not a whole lot of knowledge about vasculitis as a whole from that community 6 years ago. So I wonder what that's like now, kind of going into a new city and starting, I don't know if I'd call it from scratch, maybe you would call it from scratch, but starting a new program geared toward promoting and researching vasculitis.
Yeah, no, it has definitely been an adventure, and I'm still in the early stages of it. So I trained in vasculitis at Northwestern with Dr. Amy Archer and Dr. Anisha Dua and a couple folks there. And but life has kind of brought me out of Chicago, and I'm headed to Milwaukee instead. And so I reached out to the people at Freighter to see if they would be interested in bringing on someone who specialized in vasculitis, and they seemed excited about it, and so they've been really supportive of getting everything started. And I think it's really important. I mean, there's a lot of people who are already there who are very competent and very able to treat vasculitis, but I do think that it can be helpful to have sort of a specialized program. And in addition to just for rare diseases, it's always helpful to have a lot of volume and get very familiar with the diseases. But then it also opens up good avenues for collaboration and avenues for research as well. So that's something that I'll be able to do there, which I'm really excited about it. So I was lucky enough to get a Rheumatology Research Foundation Scientist Development Grant from the American College of Rheumatology, which is going to be great because I'm able to continue my current research projects when we go to Freighter or Medical College of Wisconsin, which will be really, really important because the research that I've been started at Northwestern has been a fair bit of work, and I'm looking forward to continuing it there.
So could you talk actually a little bit about that research? What kind of work are you continuing to do?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I think vasculitis research is sort of the main thing that I do. I focus on giant cell arteritis, and my general goal over the past couple of years has been to try to get as much as we can out of tissue. It's an interesting disease in that we actually get a sample of vascular tissue, which is I think you had Peter Grayson on a short while ago, and he said that you can't biopsy the aorta, which is very true. But you can biopsy the temporal artery. But so far, we really only get sort of a yes/no vote on that. Yes, it's temporal arteritis, or no, it's not temporal arteritis. And so I've been trying to get more information out of that. And I did a project with Dr. Grayson that's under review right now. But the goal of my projects that I'm working on right now is to use some sort of fancy cell identification to see if there's more in this tissue than we currently know. If kind of right now we sort of can say, there's a couple specific cells and we can describe them broadly, but using some immunofluorescence and some typing techniques that are kind of beyond me to explain super well, we are going to be able to identify specific subtypes of cells. And I think that may improve our ability to diagnose disease early, and it may improve our ability to prognosticate, to kind of guess at what's going to happen in the future. But it's early stages of the research, so hopefully I'll be able to talk a lot more about that in the next year or two. The other thing that I'm doing, and this is sort of in a collaboration with Northwestern, is taking that same tissue and putting it into a pipeline Northwestern has for asking the next stage of the question, which is, what are the cells specifically doing, by looking at the proteins that they're making, and looking at specifically this thing called RNA, which is sort of a way that cells communicate and decide what they're going to make. So we'll be gathering that from the same tissue and trying to accomplish the same thing, seeing if we can diagnose early, seeing if we can find subtypes of disease, and seeing if we can do a better job of prognostication. I think Peter Grayson was talking about this on a recent episode of your podcast as well, which is that he thinks that there's probably not just one giant cell arteritis, there's probably a number of subtypes of it. And so part of the goal of this work will be to try and find those subtypes if we can. But like I said, it's early stages, so looking forward to at least getting started on that up at in Milwaukee.
Yeah, it seems like that's really been, I guess, a theme of some of this recent research. And like you mentioned, I mean, Dr. Grayson talked with us about RP and just the crazy amount of new data they're getting, and and the really exciting discoveries that they've been able to make. I just wonder, when you think back to when you started in this field and getting started with your study in vasculitis, did you think this was where your research would take you? Did that kind of lead you into going down this path, or were there different factors at play there for you going into that particular type of study?
Yeah, that's a great question. To some degree, research is which path you take is a combination of the things that you're excited and passionate about, and then the things that you're capable of doing, and then the things that you think will bring the most value. So when we're hearing about how the NIH started their relapsing polychondritis program, it's funny. It sounds like one particular fellow drove a lot of that. For me, giant cell arteritis was a disease that I've always been very interested in. And at Northwestern, we were doing this type of single cell RNA sequencing, which is the technical term for what I'm trying to do. And they already had a pipeline for that established in rheumatoid arthritis. And so it was kind of an easy thing to say, why don't we just try and do that same thing in vasculitis? So it's some combination of what you're passionate about, where you think you can provide value, and the kinds of things that you're capable of actually doing. So that's kind of what got me into that specific focus. But I treat all vasculitis. As part of the goal of starting the vasculitis program at Medical College of Wisconsin is just so that I can see people with giant cell arteritis, but also ANCA vasculitis, EGPA, and all the other vasculitides. So it'll be kind of a broad perspective, but research focuses tend to be pretty narrow because you can really only do one thing well most of the time.
And I guess in the same vein, when you're talking about starting this program and continuing education of medical students in research and also in treatment of vasculitis, what sort of things are you seeing with the med students? Are you seeing, or have you seen, or do you expect to see? Are you seeing an interest in vasculitis? Does it seem like something that's just kind of a fun pop question that comes up on tests, or is it something that you really see students actually pursuing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say when I said the main thing that I do is vasculitis research, I think the second major thing that I do is teaching and education. I'm very involved in teaching residents and medical students, and I just absolutely love teaching rheumatology, and I really love teaching vasculitis. And it's fun because medical students are just so interested in this topic. I mean, the diseases, so vasculitis in particular tends to be pretty fascinating when you're at that stage of your career. And there's also this interesting thing about being a medical student where you don't have a sense for how common things are yet. And then through the process of becoming a resident, you realize that you just don't see very much vasculitis. And so over time, people become so focused on the things that they do see all the time. So they get really good at treating heart failure and things like that. Whereas medical students, they're kind of a blank slate, and they tend to really, really get excited about vasculitis. So I always love talking about it to medical students, and it's a fun topic. I mean, residents are always very interested to hear, and people are always excited to hear that you see a fair bit of it, just because it is a pretty rare disorder. So it's something that I've always enjoyed teaching, and I've found the students are very, very receptive to learning about it.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. It's funny because I was just talking with my parents, and they're both longtime ER doctors, and they were describing how, like, in the late 80s, basically, like, ER was kind of a new thing that, I mean, ERs weren't even developed until the late 70s, early 80s. So that became like the thing to do. Is it almost like a generational thing where now that we're getting more development here, research, it's almost like you see these rare diseases, but you also see that the technology we have and the ability to study it, and it almost makes that kind of the path that people are driven to. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but it's just interesting to hear kind of from the outside.
Now, the field of vasculitis is actually it's fascinating. I think that the specialization that's occurring now in all of medicine, where you don't just have a cardiologist, you have an interventionalist and an electrophysiologist, and probably have subtypes of those now, for all I know. But that's happening in rheumatology now, where people are really kind of carving out their own focuses or foci. I don't know. We're seeing that in rheumatology now, where you have lupus doctors and scleroderma doctors, and there's certainly a cadre of vasculitis doctors, and there's a lot of them are very young. I can think, there's definitely a group that has been established and has done some amazing work. But there's a lot of people who are in my cohort who are excited about this field and are starting up programs kind of around the country. So it's been a lot of fun interacting with them and feeling like I'm not the only one who's doing this kind of thing.
So speaking of kind of the broadening and the range of ongoing work in vasculitis, right now we talked about a little bit before the podcast started, the American College of Rheumatology is teaming up with the Vasculitis Foundation and other researchers and medical professionals to create some updated guidelines for vasculitis treatment. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the purpose of guidelines like that and what that really means for vasculitis.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I mean, I personally, I love guidelines. There's a lot of good things about guidelines, and there's certainly some limitations to guidelines that people should be aware of. But I think this is a very important project that I think will help the field quite a bit. So I mean, just to start about the good. So guidelines are important because they help us standardize practice. I think a recurring theme on your show has just been how hard it is for people to find the right treatments and to find the right diagnosis, and having guidelines sort of facilitates that process, because people who may not be as familiar with these diseases have somewhere to look to find out, what's the standard of care here? What should we be doing for this? And I mean, that actually helps empower patients too, because if you can, I think something that I've really enjoyed hearing about in your podcast is just patients and how strong their advocacy for themselves has been. And it's hard because sometimes that's necessary in these diseases, and it's certainly not the way you want things to be, but it's been impressive and kind of inspiring. But having guidelines can help with that too, because it sort of establishes the sort of standard of care. The other really important thing about guidelines, and the guidelines that are coming up are for the VF guidelines are for primarily the management, but the ACR guidelines just put out guidelines on the diagnosis of giant cell as well, which is really important because adequately characterizing diseases is important for running clinical trials. And I think in the field of vasculitis, there have been a lot of important trials the last 5 to 10 years or so, and there's a lot more coming down the pipeline. So being able to accurately diagnose something and classify a disease is important. And then the last thing is that guidelines are just wonderful for education. It helps you sort of structure your perspective when you're talking about things. And I think that one of the barriers for people teaching is not being confident that they know the right answers, or not being confident that they are expert enough to teach a topic. And so, so I worked on a teaching residence curriculum when I was a resident. And a lot of time residents, the main reason they're not teaching a medical student or an intern about a disease is because they themselves aren't totally sure of what they should be teaching. So having a guideline to fall back on and say, well, this is what the guidelines recommend, can really facilitate teaching between physicians, and then it can really help teaching with patients as well. And I think physicians educate patients, and patients educate physicians. And again, having just a standard by which for which to refer is really important. I think can help people communicate and learn more about these diseases. So a really valuable project for a number of reasons.
And needless to say, it's been a massive undertaking. I know this started sometime in 2019, and it would have been completed around now with or without the COVID pandemic. So it's certainly been a long time in the making. I just think about, and I feel like, I look at my experience in a city like Milwaukee. Milwaukee, you can kind of extrapolate to a lot of other large cities around the country as places where you've got an inner city population that is particular in the most type of cases low income and without great access to healthcare. And I just think about, say, EGPA, which I was diagnosed with. You have these underlying asthmatic symptoms, which are not really diagnosed when you're talking about inner city kids or young adults or whoever who are just coughing and have to go to their ERs, where doctors might not really know to think about it. So I just think about, maybe, I'm not sure if this is something you particularly thought about when you looked at something like these guidelines. Obviously, there's got to be a certain point, right, where people are coming in, and you can at least think about from a diagnosis point of view. But when you just look at the breadth of vasculitis and how many of our different diseases have these underlying conditions that a lot of people have, just every day, is this something that can maybe help with that diagnosis and kind of trickle down into some of those lower income communities where people are maybe just living with this stuff their whole life and never really knowing if that's actually it, just because they cough and it's like, well, you got asthma. I don't know. It's something that it seems like maybe this could be a benefit for, not just for middle class folks who already have good healthcare, who are maybe just needing that bump over the top of, maybe it could trickle down even more. I'm not sure.
No, I think that's very true. I think that a lot of what communities need is knowledge and information, and spreading good information helps everyone for sure. And I think that, I've worked at a number of hospitals that are in communities that may have a higher need for this sort of information. And so I think that that's definitely another avenue for this project, is to kind of help the physicians who work there, and then the patients who are in those communities to find this information. So I think that's definitely another good angle for them. It is interesting. So I've said a lot of the good things about guidelines, and the VF guidelines I believe are management, but you said an important word there, which is getting a diagnosis. And an important limitation of the guidelines that are coming out for a lot of these diseases is that they're not technically diagnostic guidelines. Has anyone talked about that on the podcast yet? I don't think so.
No, you are the first.
All right. Well, so get ready for some nitty gritty.
First time for everything. All right.
This is getting pretty into the weeds here, but this is an important distinction. And I think this is a really important thing for patients to know and for physicians to know, because I think a lot of physicians aren't aware of this. But so the guidelines that are coming out for diagnosis, at least, are not technically diagnostic guidelines. They're what we call classification criteria. And we typically use those words interchangeably. So we'll say, oh, well, the diagnostic criteria for giant cell arteritis say that I can get an ultrasound, and that's, worth 5 points, just like a temporal artery biopsy is worth 5 points. And so, that's the diagnosis. But lost in that conversation is that they're actually classification criteria, and they serve a slightly different purpose. So, diagnostic criteria, the best example of these is the DSM-4 or 5 now, the thing that psychologists use and psychiatrists use to diagnose psychiatric disorders. And the goal of those guidelines of the DSM-4 is to provide a way to diagnose somebody. Now, classification criteria is a little bit different in that you're trying to classify people, and it's really more aimed towards clinical trials. And so the classification criteria tend to be aimed at making a more homogeneous population. And so they tend to be a little more strict. So what I've found, and a good example of this is the recent lupus classification criteria were published. And they said that you had to have a positive ANA to be diagnosed with lupus. Which is not unreasonable. I mean, at least 95% of people with lupus have a positive ANA, but there are a small subgroup of people who will test negative for an ANA at some point. And those people would technically be excluded from the criteria, even though, functionally we should consider them as having lupus. And, I've seen this in vasculitis as well. So I had a patient who came to me with concern for ANCA vasculitis. For some complicated reasons, they'd been on steroids for about 4 weeks, and they'd gotten rituximab. And we checked for PR3s, ANCAs, and they were negative. But I still called them ANCA vasculitis because, a lot of the time, people who don't technically meet the criteria still probably have a disease. And so I think, just to bring it all home and give some functional advice for how to approach these, is that if you're looking at classification criteria, there are people who certainly have the disorder who may not meet the classification criteria, and part of that's because they're kind of aimed towards clinical trials as opposed to necessarily diagnosing individual patients. And then there are also people who meet the classification criteria but certainly don't have the disorder. That's less common, and the way these are designed, they tend to function a little bit better in this direction. But there's certainly limitations of these, and we got to be careful not to overinterpret them.
I think that's a really important distinction that I actually was really unfamiliar with. And I'm curious, if insurance coverage and questions surrounding that are taken into account at all when classification criteria are established. Because I know Ben and I have talked previously about needing to get approval for things like rituximab, Nucala, and needing a very specific diagnosis in order to get those things pre-approved so that we can, use them without spending $25,000 out of pocket. So how are factors like that taken into account, if at all?
Oh boy, that's a complicated question, but a really good one, and one that I think we all live with constantly. So there's the easy bar for insurance approval, which is if a medication is FDA approved for an indication, it tends to be pretty easy to get a hold of it. So at least in our context, I haven't had too much trouble getting tocilizumab eventually for giant cell arteritis, or getting rituximab for ANCA-associated vasculitis. Those sorts of things tend to be easy if there's FDA approval. Now, there's a second layer where there's some medications that are generally approved, even though they may not be technically have an FDA seal of approval. And a lot of those are the things that you'll find in guidelines. And so guidelines can often open those sorts of approvals up. And if you do need to go to bat for your patient, which we're always doing, it's always helpful to be able to cite a guideline and say, I understand that you guys are denying this medication, but per the 2020 Vasculitis Foundation ACR guidelines, this is a recommended therapy. It really facilitates those conversations. So, and then over time, as insurance companies kind of catch up, a lot of the time the things that are in guidelines will also wind up on formularies and things like that. But it's very opaque, and there's so many layers, and one insurance company which will cover something based on something won't cover it based on another. So I very much think guidelines will help with that, but it's not a panacea, unfortunately.
Oh, as Kaylee mentioned, we have certainly discussed this in the past. More, it's just rambling patients who have had to deal with it more than anything. But it does tie into just management overall, because that's a big thing in the ACR. These guidelines are looking at, and it's just amazing. The amount of knowledge we have now, even compared to say 5-6 years ago, and that's kind of the timeline we look at for people like me and Kaylee who have been diagnosed that long. But I just think back to my and I was a very small part of these, helping out with the guidelines on like the patient panel, where they you sit in a room and you just go around for like 9 hours. They ask you all these questions, and you basically are asked to agree or disagree with them. And I remember one of them was like, you get to the eGPA part, and it's okay. Is Cytoxan the most effective method of control for your after initially being diagnosed? And I'm like, no, not even close. So it's amazing to me that going through a lot of these, it seems like, and I'm assuming for these guidelines, once they're released, we'll see a lot of different answers as to what was maybe commonly accepted in the past. And I guess that's where we get into the whole management part of it, and just how the ongoing research, I would think, is playing such a big role in it.
No, absolutely. I think that there will certainly be some subtle changes to what a lot of people have been doing when these come out. And there may be, I think the major thing that it will probably influence practice outside of people who are, specifically trained or have seen a lot of vasculitis. So I think it may change a lot of paradigms. Unfortunately, I think cyclophosphamide will still be included. It's a tough medicine for people, but sometimes it's necessary. I think rituximab is going to get a boost, but they'll both be included. I think it's really great that you're involved in that panel. I think that's something that medicine has just been pushing, and very importantly so, is getting more patient involvement in all of these activities. And so I just worked on a systematic review, and we had a number of patient representatives who really helped out with that project. And being 9 hours on a panel sounds like a lot of work, but I can assure you it's important and valuable, and I think that these guidelines will be much better for it.
Right. Well, Dr. Dew was leading it, so that made it a little easier, because we knew her and she's awesome. So I obviously, yeah. Despite my protests of the Cytoxan, you are probably right. It's not going to end forever. But I felt like I could at least get my voice out there, and it is kind of how, like, and Kaylee and I have talked about this. And you mentioned it earlier, just the whole concept of patient advocacy, and that it definitely kind of helps you feel a little bit more empowered as a patient, even though you you obviously don't have all the answers, but you at least feel comfortable, sharing your voice. And Kaylee, I know you've been involved, right, in similar stuff too, and part of that is obviously your education and having a master's in public health, but I'm sure that's helped you too, right? I mean, just with coping with everything and kind of getting through that initial, 2-year stage where it is obviously rough for a lot of us, and you're just sort of waiting to get the right answers, so to speak.
Definitely. And I, speaking of that sort of education and how it works, I wanted to go back to Dr. Putnam's point about spreading good information and how that's really important for vasculitis, but really generally for medical practice. And to switch gears a little bit, Dr. Putnam, as we have acknowledged in our introduction, you have had your own podcast since early 2018, the Evidence-Based Rheumatology Podcast, and also a very active Twitter account at EBRoom. And I just wanted to ask a little bit about, the little drop there. You should follow everyone. But could you just tell us a little bit about your ongoing role in medical outreach and the podcast, how you select your topics, how you really are making sure that your message is heard?
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. And it's something I've been very involved in. I said that vasculitis research is the main thing I do, and then the second thing is kind of outreach, and this has been a big part of that. So I started the podcast because I really care about evidence-based medicine, and evidence-based medicine can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. But for me, it's a combination of critical appraisal, which is sort of reading articles and trying to analyze them as opposed to just sort of taking what they say at face value. And then using various like performance characteristics and things like that to apply medical information to clinical practice. So I see evidence-based medicine as kind of bridging the gap between the information that's being produced and the application of that information in patient care. And so that's kind of been the focus of my podcast, is just essentially reading and analyzing trials and trying to share that in as accessible of a way as I can. I've had a number of patients say that they enjoyed listening to it at that level. A number have said that they wished it was a little less dense. But the goal has really been to try to critically analyze papers and try to make that information as accessible as possible. So that's kind of what I've done in that area, and I've really enjoyed it. And it's fun hearing other people start a podcast and feeling the same kind of remembering when I was doing that as well. And I've only been at it for a couple of years now, so I'm essentially new to it, just like you guys are. And y'all have much more professional start than I did. My first 10 episodes were barely listenable, but I think you guys really hit the ground running. Probably thanks in part to Ben having background in this, but yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's something that like I said, I really enjoy teaching, and this is kind of, I enjoy teaching and talking to patients. I enjoy teaching medical students and residents, and this is kind of my way to sort of teach just more broadly, and it's been wonderful. It's been really a lot of fun.
Well, it's funny you say that with the with the papers and stuff, because I've seen that every once in a while coming across various sort of publications, and it's usually how it goes is I look at it, I recognize about 3 words, I then ask my parents, what does this mean? They also are like, I don't know, and then I just forget about it. So it's nice to hear that there's, and I think one of the most recent there was, I think it might have been, it's either GPA, eGPA study of where the actual like activity of the cell comes from, why the cell itself responds the way it does, and it was kind of like suggestive of some sort of parasitic reaction, and it can kind of help on a very cellular level, and something we went into a little bit with Dr. Grayson, just kind of inform for researchers how they think of this stuff. So that's just one example, but it's awesome to hear about. I also, Kaylee, I didn't even know that like Room Twitter was a thing, or any of these other. As a sports broadcaster, like I had no idea this whole world existed. So I feel like my eyes have been opened into like the whole medical Twitter universe. Even if I can't understand most of what is being talked about, I appreciate that it's out there. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I've been generally very impressed by Room Twitter. I think Twitter on the whole gets a pretty bad rap as being a lot of trolls and a lot of negativity, but the rheumatology Twitter is remarkably collaborative and friendly, and I think it's just a good community overall. I've actually thoroughly enjoyed it. I encourage everyone to kind of hop on and the Vasculitis Foundation has an account, and just try to get involved with it as you can.
I definitely retweet our episodes and anything that mentions Ben and me. That's great.
Well, just
sure.
Kaylee, it's only really you we need to mention. I mean, I being in sports with no sports, I've been very limited in my Twitter usage, mostly out of not wanting to just be depressed by all of us not having work and just blabbering about random stuff that we, like Estonian cricket or something, or like the dart throwing championships where the guy, gets disqualified because his Wi-Fi goes out, stuff like that. I don't want to see that because it's too depressing. So, but it is cool that it's out there.
I think they're bringing some of the sports back, I hear, correct? I mean, the basketball seems like it might be happening. Hockey for sure. We're
getting closer. Unfortunately for me, most of what I do is college sports, and that is probably the toughest to figure out. And of course, it's hard not to feel a little bit conflicted when you have, for Kaylee and I having a disease and being knowing that we are immunocompromised and in that higher risk category. You obviously, you want to put yourself out there. You want to go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Kaylee, you've been pretty lucky, right? Because you've been able to work from home mostly. But it's certainly tough when you're in a business where things are needed to be done in person in large stadiums with lots of people in a close setting, and you kind of know. So it's hard to really know what to how to feel with that, because obviously I can't wait to be doing games again, but I also we've been pretty careful, trying to stay healthy, and that's, I think, the dichotomy that we are all in at the current moment.
Yeah, I think that's very wise, and it's something that I think all of us are sort of experiencing with our patients. That a lot of patients with vasculitis are on relatively strong immunosuppression, and they're certainly at a high risk group. I have a couple patients that I think about often, just thinking, I really hope things are still going well, because it's sort of a scary time to be on these medications. Thankfully, so far, a lot of the information about COVID has been reassuring for patients with rheumatic diseases. So on the whole, it hasn't been as scary of a risk as I would have expected, which has been good. But at the same time, it's certainly smart to be very careful, and I think all of us are trying to make sure we can be as supportive of that as possible. I've written a lot of notes and things to try and get people as much time as they can to be careful. We're all kind of trying to get through this, and it's definitely harder on people who have pre-existing conditions.
Definitely, I think this was I don't want to say completely unforeseen, because I think some people were preparing for pandemics for a while, but overall, I think most of the medical professionals that I'm in touch with did not really see this coming to the same degree. So I can definitely see how that would impact patient care. So we don't want to take up too much of your time. You're already, taking away the time from finishing up your construction. But I just wanted to see if there's anything else you wanted to touch on in terms of advice to give students, researchers, or just things that you want our audience to know.
Oh my gosh! Wow, that's a great broad kind of exit. I'd say, just broad advice for students is just to try and balance the things in your life that you're passionate about and enjoying. I think that we're all kind of in a strange time right now, and I think balance is as important as ever. I really enjoyed your recent podcast talking about wellness as an approach, and the techniques they were using to try and to get there. And I think this is a time where we all kind of need to take a little step back and make sure we're focusing on staying healthy, and then just as a general note, I just wanted to thank you guys for doing this podcast. I think it's really important, and I think the Vasculitis Foundation is doing really important work, and I've enjoyed listening to it, and looking forward to hearing more episodes in the future. So yeah, thanks to both of you for what you're doing, and to the VF for sponsoring it, and looking forward to everything else you guys have coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's I've certainly, I think Kaylee feels the same way. We've learned a ton on each episode from all of our different guests. It's been awesome, especially for me, not having the super medical background, just being able being able to learn and hear different perspectives. And I know one of your colleagues, Dr. Du, is going to be on one of our upcoming episodes. So yeah, we're just kind of keeping the pipeline going. We've been really lucky to have the support of the VF kind of helping us out and getting some great guests. It's been awesome.
She'll be a really good guest. She and I have done a couple debate podcasts together, and I'm sure you guys will have a lot of fun talking. And she's always has a lot of insights. She taught me a lot of what I know about vasculitis. I think she'll be a fantastic person to have on the show.
Very cool. Yeah, we'll have. I know we'll have her. We'll have Dr. Byram from Vanderbilt. Those are two newer members of the VF board, so we're going to have them on shortly. Yeah, that's a little teaser for everybody. That's Kaylee. That I know you're learning a lot about the the broadcast podcast business. So
I'm taking notes.
That's the teaser.
Kevin's
that's
another
what we
great
go
guy.
with.
Yeah, he's another great guy. That's two phenomenal guests you have coming up.
All right, you know what? Good job from Ed Becker. He's in charge of scheduling our guests, so he did a good job, obviously, on that one, and of course with this one. It's been awesome to have you on, Dr. Putman. Obviously, continued success. We're wishing you all the best with this transitionary time, getting the new program started at Freighter there at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and we certainly are glad you could carve out some time today, come on the podcast, and give us some new things to think about here going forward. So thanks again, and all the best.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and best of luck to both of y'all on the endeavor here.
Thank you so much, and good luck with the rest of the construction and also your upcoming professorship.
Thank you. Have a good one.
All right, just wrapping up here. A great episode as always. Thanks again to Dr. Mike Putman for joining us, and we certainly hope things go smoothly with his. As soon as he told us, Kaylee, that he demolishes houses in his spare time, I guess it's kind of a temporary thing. I figured we needed to mention it, but it is hot here in Wisconsin these summers. They get pretty toasty, so it's not just. I know Maryland is historically warm in summers, so we both have that going for us right now, I guess. But good to mention it, and I hope that goes well for him.
Absolutely. And there's my favorite word of the podcast. Absolutely. But definitely, we're glad to have on Dr. Putman, and reminder to all of our listeners to please follow him at EB Room on Twitter. You can see his podcast and also his other explanations of ongoing medical research specific to rheumatology and specifically vasculitis. So definitely tune in and check that out as well. Yeah,
it's a good thing to remind everybody of, and of course subscribe if you have not done that yet. We will have more really exciting podcasts coming up soon. I mentioned this a little bit. We plugged it a little earlier in the podcast, but Doctors Kevin Byram from Vanderbilt, Dr. Anisha Dua as well from Northwestern, they will both be joining us on the same podcast coming up. I believe that will be our next one. We are still kind of TBD on when that will be scheduled, but they will be on an upcoming podcast. We have a couple other guests that we're getting lined up as well. So that is what you can all look forward to. We also want to thank, of course, our sponsors for the podcast in GSK and Genentech. And again, thank you for listening to this episode. Can't wait to have you on next time as listeners. Kaylee, great job as always. As I mentioned, I feel like every time I learned a lot. And we want to thank Dr. Mike Putman as well. So I think that's everything. We've taken care of all of our business, so we'll say so long. This has been for Kaylee saying goodbye, and we'll see you next time on the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast.